Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the confession U.S. President Barack Obama made to Tom Friedman in the New York Times interview, in which the president promises that the United States will protect Israel against Iran, should offer absolutely no sense of relief for Israel. Now, I should explain that this entire discussion is about an op-ed by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times. Normally, this part of the show, which is background briefing, deals with a topic, not a column. And yet, sometimes the column is so huge and so important that I need to make it the background briefing. The column becomes the most important item to discuss, and it becomes the news piece that needs more insight and more analysis. This conversation between President Obama and Tom Friedman took place in the Oval Office. It was a one-on-one with the president. Friedman asks cogent and penetrating questions and forces Obama to address serious issues that the American people wanted answers to. As an aside, this was an interview worthy of the president. Regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with the president, Obama sat with Friedman, and it was a composed and presidential media moment. It was not like Obama on The Tonight Show or on Comedy Central or even in the tub with that very strange woman with the hair and the Cheerios. This was a presidential moment. In his interview, Obama blithely explained that he understood Israel's point of view. He emphasized that the United States would not allow the situation with Iran to get out of hand. He said that he was pretty certain that Iran would not get a nuclear weapon. His exact phraseology was that, quote, number one, this is our best bet by far to make sure Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, unquote. Even if I were a betting man, I would not chance a roll of the dice concerning the surety of the deal between Iran and the United States. No matter what the odds, Israel cannot accept that wager. The reality is that the real issue with Obama's blank promise is far bigger than the President of the United States even imagines. Since the very creation of the State of Israel, under the leadership of Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, Israel has functioned under one defensive principle alone. Israel does not subcontract its defense and security to anyone. This principle is that in the end, the only way that Israel can defend itself, it must be certain that it defends itself alone. Israel should defend itself, period. Israel can rely on no one else, no other country or entity to determine its defense or on the variables on which that defense is based. According to Ben-Gurion and the principle of Ben-Gurion, Israel cannot allow its decisions to be clouded by others and their interpretation of the safety concerns. Israel, cannot allow the concerns or good intentions of others to encroach on their priorities, on Israel's priorities. Receiving aid and assistance is one thing, but being brought under the protective wing is something fundamentally different. It assumes, and to assume that the United States or any country would act in Israel's best interest and not in their own best interest is a fatal mistake. According to Ben-Gurion, Israel needs to be in a situation in which when they need to act, they can act without being hampered by any outside interests or constraints. When it comes to the security of the country, Israel cannot wait to receive permission before acting, not when it comes to matters like securing its water, and certainly not when it comes to a preemptive strike against Iran. A few years ago, on September 6, 2007, Israel launched an air raid into Syria that destroyed a nuclear facility in Al-Kibar that had been built by the North Koreans. Years earlier, in June of 1981, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Iraq at their nuclear facility in Osirak. That facility, too, was destroyed by Israel. The most famous strike carried out by Israel took place in 1967, in the midst of the Six-Day War itself. That was the beginning of the Six-Day War, when Israel's Air Force preemptively and simultaneously struck the air forces of neighboring countries, Egypt and Syria. These examples of strikes made public. There are numerous examples of other strikes by Israel inspired by the need to protect their country that have never been made public. Israelis know that their leadership has a multitude of plans on the table that can and will quickly be put into action if and when the needs arise. That knowledge helps Israelis sleep better at night. A vague promise from Obama that causes restless nights. This U.S. promise, delivered by the U.S., should be rejected by Israel. And Israel should make it very clear to the President of the United States that, while they want to work together, Israel does not want to, nor will it ever, be protected by the United States. If you noticed, I did not even call into question whether or not the United States could, or when the need arose, could defend Israel. That's an entirely different question. Obviously, the government of Israel is not happy with the framework agreement, the nuclear agreement with Iran. In response to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who said in a statement that any agreement that permits Iran that kind of latitude on nuclear technology must insist that Iran recognize Israel. Here's his quote. Israel demands that any final agreement with Iran will include a clear and unambiguous Iranian comment of Israel's right to exist. Unquote. Netanyahu said that in a statement. The idea is a brilliant counter. It's a parry to Iran's demand for nuclear technology. Why? Because if Iran really wants this technology, they must state publicly that Israel has the right to exist. And if they have the right to exist, then there will be no fear or even a question over using that nuclear material to wipe Israel off the map. I spent hours poring over the text of the 4-page agreement between Iran and the P5+1. Hours. Or what is commonly called, by the way, the P5+1 is commonly called the Western powers. Well, it is not correct. It is filled with specifics, the agreement, but the specifics are ambiguous and the details are oblique. There are huge loopholes and details are simply missing in a lot of areas. Some have responded saying, yes, of course, that is to be expected. It's only a framework agreement. Now, the final agreement will hammer out all the details. There's where the problem is. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu thinks otherwise. He spoke about the details in the agreement after the cabinet meeting on the eve of Passover. He said, quote, Israel will not accept an agreement which allows a country that vows to annihilate us to develop nuclear weapons, period, unquote. And then he continues, quote, the deal must include a clear and unambiguous Iranian recognition of Israel's right to exist. Then Netanyahu continued, the cabinet is united strongly opposing the proposed deal. Such a deal does not block Iran's path to the bomb. Such a deal paves Iran's path to the bomb. It might very well spark a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East, and it would greatly increase the risks of terrible war. He continued, they would not shut down a single nuclear facility in Iran, would not destroy a single centrifuge in Iran, and will not stop research and development on Iran's advanced centrifuges, he said. He continued, on the contrary, the deal would legitimize Iran's illegal nuclear program. It would leave Iran with a vast nuclear infrastructure. A vast nuclear infrastructure remains in place, unquote. There is absolutely no ambiguity in Netanyahu's comments. A framework for an agreement was announced. I do not think it was going to happen. I didn't think it was going to happen, period. And yet it did, as I read the agreement, or more accurately, as what information we are now seeing is being spoon-fed to us about the agreement, not what's being written in the agreement. It seems the Iranians have agreed to many of the U.S. demands, but they have their own interpretation of them. It seems that they agree to a 10-year and 15-year waiting period and agreed not to develop nuclear technology during that period of time. The only better agreement would have been a total preventing of their nuclear activity, and the U.S. and the Iranians would never go for that, that's for sure. There are big issues with the 15-year deal and what happens after 15 years, let's say, for instance, or after 10 years. What happens to the site of Fordow, let's say, for instance? Fordow is the place where thousands of centrifuges are being housed. There have been only a few proper inspections there, period. Fordow is buried 90 yards under solid rock and cement. It's built into and under a mountain. And what happens when this agreement is not fulfilled? Iran has never been forthcoming in their negotiations. There is no reason why this should be an exception to that. Fordow will not be shut down. It's supposed to be transformed into a center for nuclear physics. The Iranian Foreign Minister, Zarif, plainly explained that this center would neither dismantle nor destroy the already existing centrifuges. There could have been far worse agreements, I agree. The real issue here is how to make this agreement work and how to fill in the loopholes. Meanwhile, President Obama has called Netanyahu and the U.S. National Security Team, Obama's best team, is literally in Jerusalem and going back and forth to Jerusalem to brief the Israeli Prime Minister and to offer him a slew of gifts. The hope is that over the next 10 to 15 years, there will be a change in regime in Iran. The best military minds in Israel say that Israel has what I call a knockdown punch, not a knockout punch. Knock down, not knock out. They can set the Iranian program back 3 to 4 years, and some say they can set it back 10 years. Well, 10 years is effectively destroying the program. That's very good. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column. Actually, we're only going to do one other column today. The main reason is that we just spent a very long time talking and speaking about and analyzing Tom Friedman's column in the background briefing. The column we're going to cover is another very important column. It tries to show ISIS as murderers of Christians, that ISIS is crucifying Christians and Muslims. The column is by DeRoy Murdoch. Murdoch is a Fox News contributor. He's a syndicated columnist for Scripps Howard News Service and is contributing editor with the National Review Online. He went to undergraduate school at Georgetown, got an MBA at NYU, and he's actually a first-generation American. His parents came to the United States from Costa Rica. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. This piece was published on April 4th, 2015, and is entitled An Epic Evil Returns. ISIS Resurrects Crucifixion. Murdoch sets the stage with the seasonal holiday point. He refers to Easter and the crucifixion of Yeshu, or as Jesus, as the Christians call him. And then he shows that ISIS is crucifying people using this, quote, ancient custom. He describes how people are led into town square and how masses of people come out to watch the brutal murder. But he concludes the essay by saying the following, quote, "The time is now to exterminate ISIS, throw its collective corpse in a cave, and block the entrance with a boulder," unquote. That's how he ends. Of course, Murdoch's final lines are a literary and historical allusion. They refer to that very style of burial from the time of the Second Temple, when bodies, like Jesus's, were killed, and after they were killed, or after they died, they were put in caves and sealed with a huge boulder. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. We'll be looking at 3 cartoons today. The first cartoon is by Mike Lukovich. Lukovich draws in the Atlantic Journal-Constitution. Now, since he's been there since 1989, he was born in Seattle, Washington, graduated from the University of Washington. He even drew a comic strip about two dim-witted superheroes called Super Zeros. Great title. A play on heroes, zeros, only they're misfits, and as a result, he called them Super Zeros instead of superheroes. This cartoon portrays U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry sitting down and signing a treaty with Iran's Grand Ayatollah, the Ayatollah Khamenei. Kerry is holding a piece of paper called The Nuke Deal. It's entitled The Nuke Deal. On the table is a mug, and it's in front of the Ayatollah. The mug is red with a huge yellow face, a happy face on it. You know those yellow faces with the black lines creating a happy face. Kerry says in the cartoon itself to the Ayatollah, quote, "Plus, it'll freak out warmongering anti-Obama Republicans." The Ayatollah then responds to Kerry by saying, quote, "Nuff said," and he signs the nuclear deal. This is hilarious. It's a major critique of the Iranian deal. It's actually saying that one of the most enticing elements of a deal with Iran would be to upset the Republicans. Now that's funny because it does upset the Republicans. But of course, it's not true at all. Whatever you may think about the deal, and I'm sure you have opinions on it, Obama, the President of the United States, really truly believes that a deal with Iran will prevent them from moving to a nuclear weapons capability situation and make the world a safer place to be. The next cartoon, or actually the next two cartoons, are by a cartoonist named Bob Gorill. Now, Bob Gorill is distributed by and syndicated through Creators Syndicate. Gorill is a product of Greensboro, North Carolina. He was born there and went to school very close to there at University of Virginia. He was a cartoonist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and this cartoon was published on April 10th, 2015. It depicts President Obama sitting at a table with Prime Minister Netanyahu. In between them is an hourglass. You know that fancy hourglass? You know, the one with the sand, the old-fashioned sand timer? The sand is flowing from the top to the bottom, from the upper level to the lower part of the glass. Next to it, next to the clock, the glass itself, is a sign with the word Iran on it. Obama says, quote, "The glass is half full," unquote. Then Bibi says, quote, "half empty," unquote. The words full and empty have exclamation marks on them, and they're written in red. The piece is very funny. Gorill is trying to say that this argument between Bibi and Obama is simply about perceptions of the same scenario. The old argument, or conundrum, is the glass half full or half empty? The problem with this, and the very interesting portrayal, is that in the glass is half full and half empty discussion, the dispute is about perspective, the perspective of optimism versus skepticism, that the reality is the same, just two different views of the same reality. But in this case, between Obama and Bibi, their perspectives are extremely different. But not the reality also is different. You see, that's the deal. It's not about rose-colored versus pessimistic approaches to Iran. Rather, it's about an issue of life versus death. The last cartoon is also by Bob Gorill. It was published on April 8th, 2015. This is a takeoff on a theme that has been used since the Vietnam War. It combines a series of symbols that represent groups and ideas and spells out the word coexist. Now, I've seen many variations of this and actually even shown you some on television. In this case, the C is the Muslim crescent. The O, from coexist, is the peace sign. The E, the male-female symbol. The X actually is the Star of David. I is topped by the symbol of Wicca, which is the religion of witchcraft. The S is the yin-yang, and the T is the cross of Christianity. Burning up part of the banner on which the word coexist is written is a huge cloud of smoke. And in the cloud are the words Islamic extremists. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. ISIS has just launched an English-language radio bulletin service. And that's remarkable. Every day, ISIS puts out a bulletin that runs 9 minutes and 30 seconds long. The intro and the end of each of these bulletins showcase traditional Arabic music. The bulletins contain news, headlines, and eschew the ISIS point of view, similar to what is produced and presented on ISIS radio network to their issues with regard to Russian and Afghani. This English language bulletin joins these already existing bulletins. ISIS has opened a social media campaign with the expressed purpose of driving committed followers and other interested parties to listen to their taped broadcasts. There was a huge Twitter response to the new radio spots. ISIS is creating slick, impressive, professional, youth-oriented media. That should be no surprise. This radio bulletin is just another in a slew of spectacular media products that ISIS has released in order to lure young people to their cause and to attract people to fight for their cause in Iraq and Syria. These media casting calls by ISIS must be answered by equally attractive counter-appeals. Unfortunately, the Western media response has been at best uninspired and lackluster. And now, a little bit about U.S. politics and candidates. Candidates are starting to get serious about the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Hillary Clinton has declared. Rand Paul has declared. Marco Rubio has declared. Jeb Bush will probably be next. He has the name recognition and can be a formidable candidate. Jeb Bush tweeted a serious critique of President Obama the other day. Obama met with Raul Castro, the leader of Cuba, a repressive, anti-democratic regime. We know that Obama has intentions regarding Cuba. But Bush called him to task in a very different way. He asked, how can you meet with Castro and not with Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu? And here's the quote from his Twitter account. Quote, Obama meets with Castro but refused to meet with @Netanyahu, unquote. Then Bush continued on Twitter, quote, why legitimize a cruel dictator of a repressive regime, unquote. There's something profound about that statement. The purpose behind Jeb Bush's tweet was important. Bush was to be seen as the defender of Israel. It was to get him front and center in the eyes of Jewish donors and lovers of Israel, a position he does not yet occupy. This is a sure way of getting important funding, and every politician needs that funding, and certainly that funding will help boost his 2016 campaign. Finally, an insurance company has refused to insure a Jewish kindergarten in Brussels. The insurance company said that given the anti-Semitism that has been flaring up throughout Europe, the risk in insuring a Jewish kindergarten is too high. The kindergarten has a solid steel door and a 6-digit security code. Every school in the Western world needs to have insurance. Every nation and every state and every district and every city has that law in the Western world. Schools often shop around for the best deals. And when risks increase, so too do premiums and costs. But here, the premise is very different. In this case, the insurance company has said that they will simply not carry the risk. There is no premium high enough to insure a Jewish kindergarten. They say, that's unbelievable. That notion, I say to you, is simply not correct. Even this insurance company, if it prevails, even if no company is willing to insure a Jewish kindergarten, there is an alternative. In that case, the government or a multi-governmental agency should step forward and promise to cover the risk. That is what often happens in the aftermath of a terror attack. Places and people are almost always underinsured, and the government steps in to protect them. Shame on that Belgian insurance company. Shame on you. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. There's a long history of ancient Jewish burial, and it's very interesting. We have archaeological evidence of the First Temple period and the Second Temple period, biblical caves which were used as burial sites. Very wealthy families had burial caves. Bones were placed on slabs in the caves, and then the caves were closed with that large boulder that I spoke about earlier. When the next family member died, the bones were collected and put into a large sarcophagus, a large box. Hence the expression, collecting the bones. In the Second Temple period, the same tradition continued, known in Latin as a sepulchre, a cave. Flowers and fragrant objects were put in the cave to mask the smell of the decomposition of the bodies. Today in Israel, Jews bury directly in the ground with a simple cotton shroud. Men in their talit, their prayer shawl, not in a coffin at all. Here in the United States, we use simple pine boxes in Jewish tradition, and we bury 6 feet under. This is a new phenomenon. It actually happened during the Civil War. Why? Mass graves were buried too shallow, especially in the South, where the water table was too high. And after flooding, the bodies washed up and floated away, often down Main Street. So local laws were passed to bury 6 feet deep in a coffin to avoid that very ugly scene. We have seen Second Temple caves, and it's very, very interesting. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.